So dealing with arithmetic in which we have positive and negative numbers, there's a few rules that we have to follow. Not too bad. We'll start off doing some addition and subtraction and see how this works with negative numbers. So first off, if we have something like this, 5 plus a negative 3, well, anytime we're adding a negative number, we're going to interpret that the same way. It's just subtracting that. So 5 plus a negative 3, I'm just going to think of this as 5 minus 3, which of course just becomes regular subtraction, and we'll end up getting 2. This becomes not too complicated, but a little different if we have to think about having a negative number here first and then adding another negative to it. So for example, something like negative 2 plus negative 6, which you have in the notes. In this case, we're thinking of negative 2 minus 6, so still the same rule. Plus a negative is the same thing as just subtracting that number. However, we have to be careful when we're dealing with a negative 2 minus 6. This is actually negative 8 for our answer because we're taking negative 2 and subtracting 6 from it. Now, if that's a little difficult for you to make sure that you understand, it's at least how intuitive it is, you can kind of use a little trick by thinking of these guys on a number line. So here's my number line, and I'll start here at negative 2. Well, if I'm going to start at negative 2 and subtract 6, anytime I subtract a number, that tells me I need to move left on the number line. So since we're already in the negatives, I'll just put a few more numbers on here. I'll start at negative 2 and move to the left 6 units. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can see I actually arrive here at negative 8. So this is kind of a little trick that can help you if it's not totally clear what you should do when you're dealing with the negative numbers, just to make sure that you get the right guys here. So if you always remember that when you add a positive number, that moves to the right. When you subtract a number, that is the same thing as moving to the left on the number line. So this is what happens whenever we add negative numbers. If we subtract negative numbers, it becomes a little bit different. But again, the rule is not too bad. So, for example, 7 minus a negative 2. Anytime we subtract a negative number, this is going to be the same thing as adding the positive version of that number. So 7 minus negative 2 will become 7 plus a positive 2, which in this case is just regular addition. We know that's 9. What can be a little confusing is if we start with a negative number and then subtract a negative number from this. So negative 6 minus a negative 1, we really need to think of this as negative 6 plus a positive 1, which is negative 5. Now again, if it's not totally intuitive how I got the negative 5, just think of it like this. We start on the number line, so we're in the negatives, and remember the negatives kind of go in the opposite direction of the positives, so as we move from left to right, we get this. So negative 6, negative 5, negative 4, negative 3, negative 2, negative 1 to the 0, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in this case, we start at negative 6, and we're going to add 1, so that means we should move 1 unit to the right on the number line. So we start at negative 6, move 1 unit to the right, it actually goes up to negative 5. So you have to be careful. Some people that, if you're not very familiar with this, every once in a while somebody will say, oh, this is negative 7. They'll try to just add 1 to the 6 and say it's a negative 7. But we have to be very careful. Moving to the right from the negatives is a little bit counterintuitive. But again, we just start with the negative 6 on the number line, add 1 to it, that tells us to go to the right 1 unit, and that gets us up to negative 5. As you do a lot of these, you probably won't need the number line, but at first, if you're not very familiar with doing this kind of arithmetic, it can be really helpful. But as you do more of these, you'll get to where you can do most of them in your head and not really have too much of a problem with it. So let's switch gears a little bit, talk about some multiplication and division when it comes to negative numbers. And there's just basically a few rules that we need to remember. If we have something like this, a positive 3 times a positive 5, this is just regular multiplication. So a positive times a positive, we'll just end up getting a positive 15. However, if we put a negative number into the mix, it changes things a little bit. In this case, I have a negative 2 times a positive 3. Anytime we have a negative number times a positive number, the answer is always going to be negative. So in this case, I would get a negative 6. And this works the same way if I flip the order. So for example, if I have a 5 times a negative 4, again, a positive times a negative is going to give me a negative number. So in this case, I'll get a negative 20. It's different though if I have two negative numbers. So for example, if I made this guy a negative 5, so a negative 5 times a negative 4, anytime we multiply a negative number times another negative number, the answer will actually come out to be positive. So in this case, I'll get a positive 20 instead of a negative 20. So if you want a really simple way to remember it, anytime that you multiply two numbers together that have the same sign, so a positive and a positive, or a negative and a negative, you'll get positive answers. Anytime you multiply two numbers together that have different signs, so a negative and a positive, or a positive and a negative, then you will end up getting negative numbers. So kind of a quick way to always remember that. Now this works the same way for division. So for example, if I have a positive number, like a positive 10, divided by a positive 5, then this of course is just what we think of as regular division. This is just a positive 2. However, if I make one of these numbers, either in the numerator or the denominator, to be negative and leave the other one positive, then I'll end up with a negative answer. So for example, something like 12 divided by a negative 3. In this case, I'm dealing with a positive divided by a negative number. So it's the same rule that we had in multiplication. If we have opposite signs, then the answer comes out to be negative. So in this case, a positive 12 divided by a negative 3 will be a negative 4. Same thing if I have the negative in the numerator and a positive number in the denominator. In this case, negative 20 divided by positive 2 will be a negative 10 because the signs are different. However, both of the signs are the same. So for example, negative 6 divided by negative 3. In this case, I have a negative divided by a negative. Both of the signs are the same. This will come out to be a positive 2. So again, for the multiplication and division, the rules work the same. If you have two of the same signs, for example, positive, positive, negative, negative, your answer will always come out to be positive. If you have two different signs, a positive and a negative, or a negative and a positive, then your answer will always come out to be negative.